Continuing on with Chapter 6 notes, starting on page 163. So we have here, starting on this sticky note here, we have a couple of ways that ecosystems respond to being disrupted. They can be resistant to this disruption, or they can be resilient. So resistance is the ecosystem remains stable. Resilient means that it bounces back. It has some damage and it bounces back. So an ecosystem disruption could be a fire, a flood, a hurricane, some air pollution, some water pollution. Those are some examples. Occasionally we have a lot of disruption, severe disruption, a big fire, a big flood, volcano that erupts. There's two types of succession, and this again is review from biology. You have primary succession, and with primary succession you have no fertile soil or seeds. This happens after a volcanic eruption where you have lava or ash. When a glacier recedes and melts, it leaves bare rock behind. And then you have pioneer species that come first, and the pioneer species that come first is actually lichen first and then moss. After the lichen and moss come, they decompose and they create enough biomass or a little bit of soil that your grasses can grow. Grasses and some herbs, some very small plants can grow after that. The picture here at the top actually shows secondary succession, which we'll talk about on the next page. Secondary succession starts with grasses and herbs and forbs because there is fertile soil and there are seeds in the ground. And so a fire does that. A fire doesn't take away the soil. In fact, a fire makes more fertile soil. So after a fire, you start with secondary succession, and you start with grasses and herbs first, and then shrubs, and then small trees, and then large trees. So we can sticky note that on the next page, page 164. Down here at the bottom, it talks about secondary succession. Again, you have fertile soil and seeds after this. A fire when it goes through. A small flood that does not wash away your soil, so a small flood. Or even an abandoned field. So when a farmer's done farming and abandons the field, it can go through secondary succession back to a wild area. All right, the top of the page talks again about keystone species and the sea otters. So here's where we're going to sticky note about the sea otters and being a keystone species. So sea otters eat urchins. When otters are hunted, the urchins overpopulate and eat kelp holdfasts, which is, the holdfast is the bottom of the kelp plant. The kelp drifts away, and that equals a destroyed ecosystem. And you can see that here, right here at the very bottom of the kelp is called the holdfast. It holds to the rocks at the bottom of the ocean. That's why it's called a holdfast. Okay, pond succession on page 166. So pond succession is a little bit different. Let me remove the sticky note to show you. Pond succession, you have open water and some aquatic plants. The aquatic plants actually, when they die, they fall to the bottom of the pond and get decomposed and turned into actually sediments. And over time, you have more and more and more of these plants die, decompose, fall to the ground, and turn into sediments. And eventually that pond can fill up, and then plants can grow on it. And so pond succession is a little bit different than other kind of succession. So make sure you know the difference. At the end of a succession, you have a climax community, which is different in different ecosystems. For example, in a forest, the climax community will consist of large trees. But in a desert, it may consist of large bushes. Some ecosystems never return to their former state. An example is the tropical rainforest. In a tropical rainforest, the soil is terribly poor. It has very little nutrients because things decompose so fast. It's so hot, so humid, and so moist that bacteria and fungus grow, they thrive, and when something dies, a plant or an animal, the decomposers decompose it so quickly that the plants take up those nutrients so quickly up into their plant bodies, and none of it remains in the soil. So if you chop down a tropical rainforest and you wait for it to grow back, it won't grow back because it doesn't have enough nutrients in the soil. And here's another term to know. Regeneration is the term that refers to an ecosystem returning to a healthy state. The next page talks more about invasive species. This is page 167. The graphic here shows what some of the effects of zebra mussels are on the Great Lakes. And it shows here how the zebra mussels have spread even all the way to California from the Great Lakes. Some other names for invasive species are called introduced species, alien species, and not every species that gets introduced becomes an invasive species, but ones that are really strong and have no predators and can outcompete native species for resources then become a problem, and we call them invasive species. This whole process has sped up because we now have global trade throughout the world, and ships go from here and there bringing our goods and our resources and can spread species around. Page 168, we have a couple of terms that are not necessarily in your book, but they will be on your test. We will refer to this word quite often, degradation. It means deterioration of an environment through the depletion of resources such as air, water, and soil. It can also refer to the extinction of wildlife. So we will refer to things like habitat degradation, water pollution, which causes river degradation. So again, this is a term we will use quite frequently. Now this is a term that is in your chapter. Ecological restoration, returning ecosystems to their historical conditions. A couple of examples. The prairie in the middle of the United States is almost completely gone. It's an ecosystem we call a biome that is almost, again, completely gone because it is turned into farms. There are a lot of places where they are turning the prairie, they're returning abandoned farms back into the prairie. And so that's an example of ecological restoration. This is FL. It's kind of a strange thing, but that stands for Florida Everglades. My symbol looks strange here, but it's FL for Florida Everglades. Your book talks about them. They are restoring that. And they're also restoring some areas in Mesopotamia and Iraq. Turn the page to 170. There's a little paragraph here on 170 talking about restoring natural communities. The next lecture will focus on biomes. So I will pause here and I'll do biomes in a separate lecture.